Hello, this is a chapter 12 video. We're going to be looking at exception handling, try, catch and finally, and then a demo of addressbook -io to have a look at how the try and catch works when you're trying to work with files and input and outputting. So, in the previous video you looked at throwing, and so I assume you've got knowledge now of the throwing bit. So, if we throw checked exceptions, they need to be caught and responded to. Remember, previously we saw that unchecked exceptions, which inherit from the runtime exception, they don't need to be caught. However, checked exceptions do. The compiler ensures that their use is tightly controlled in both server and client objects, and if used properly, then any failures on the system can be recoverable from. So what happens is as the class and program is working away, it'll be throwing out lots of exceptions. So this is your average program which is implemented in Java, throwing lots of exceptions out, but the whole time the program is catching these exceptions and making the program proceed gracefully. And it is up to the programmer to make sure that the program proceeds gracefully and doesn't come to a grinding halt. So, when throwing some kind of exception, we need to use the throws clause as we've discussed. You must also include a throws clause in any documentation. So here's an example of one of the methods used in the IO project, the addressbook IO project, where we're actually saving a file or saving an addressbook to a specific file in the computer. So we use a save to file and string destination file name, where we'll need the path of the place we're going to save it to. So in order to use an IO exception, that's the other thing. In order to see whether you need to try and catch an IO exception, because that's what we're deciding at this point, you then need to look into the API documentation and seeing if it inherits from the runtime exception or just exception. And that way you'll know whether you'll need to have a try and catch, because otherwise it will not work if it's an exception or it's a checked exception. So here is a null pointer exception. You can see here that the null pointer exception inherits from runtime exception, so that doesn't need a try catch. Have a quick look for IO exception, and you'll see the exception will inherit directly from the exception superclass. Now, as specified by the API, if you inherit straight from there, then you need to use the try and catch keywords. So that's how we can work out if we need to use try and catch. We see that this method throws an IO exception. We've checked the API and we can see that it's a checked exception, so we need to try and catch it. So the try and catch looks like this. The try open brace and close brace, and then you have a statement in there which ultimately a exception of some kind is being thrown by that statement in there. What you then do is, if that exception is thrown, so if there's an error message and the method decides to throw that exception, then the catch will happen. So what that will do is it will catch the exception, and then it will give, in this particular catch block, it will give the exception as a parameter which you can use as a local variable to get information out of it. Often sort of a toString, or use the string version of that exception to get some information from that, or other information regarding the error message. So within that catch block you then report and recover from the exception. So here is an example of the address book and trying to save the address book to a file. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to break out the presentation, and I'm actually going to go in to show you what happens in that instance. So here is our address book IO, and you can see here we don't have a GUI anymore, we've got the address book file handler. So this address book demo does very little, only create an address book which is pretty unaccessible. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into the address book demo, and this is how it will look from the CD. It will look like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the constructor. I'm going to do a little before and after, pause and replay of this video so you can see my addition of the file handler class. So this is the before and this is the after. So this is the bit I've added in here. I've created a new object of type addressbook file handler, and if you look at the IO project you'll see that's the addressbook file handler at the bottom. Within the address book file handler, there is a method called save to file. So let's have a look at the save to file method in here. There you can see the save to file method. Now you'll see here in the documentation it says throws IO exception, so we know now just from previous experience that the IO exception inherits directly from the exception class, so that will need to be tried and caught. So then back into our address book demo, because this method needs to be tried and caught, then we just put it in a try and a catch there. Now again, I'm not going to do anything with the exception. You could do a system.out.println to get some error message, but I'm just going to assume that it's going to work, and if it doesn't work it will catch it and there will just be no error message printed out. So next job now is to have a quick look into the file location of where the where it's going to be saved to. So I'll just open up a folder. And here's the folder which it will be saved to. So now by running this now, compiling this, they will automatically go through that code and it will create that book. Now the text file it creates, the IO file stuff is out of scope of this particular presentation and out of scope of the module, because we're saving our data to a database and not to a flat file like a text file here. But if you want to look into the IO stuff, then you can, that's all well and good, but otherwise that bit of code there using the address book file handler has saved that particular address book to the book.txt file. Okay, so here is then some further information. You do the try and the catch, but what you can do is you can catch multiple exceptions. So we're going to find that when we're working with a database, it could return with multiple exceptions, so we need to deal with those separately. One exception here is an end of file exception, and the other exception is a file not found exception. So the different exceptions will require different actions which you can take. To abbreviate that, you could always use an OR statement in there, where you can catch an end of file exception or a file not found exception. So again, that's probably a sort of a neater way of doing that. The other part of the try and catch is the finally. Now the finally is something which you perform any actions here common to whether an exception is thrown or not. So whether or not the exception gets thrown, then the finally statement will be issued. So it's something which, you know, let's just go ahead and do it whatever the outcome of the try and catch. So when we're looking at our databases, our connection process is going to look something like this. In our try block, we're going to have the connect to the database class, connect and open the specific database, and perform actions on that database. All of those tasks there are all very error inducing things. Then we're going to catch a class not found exception or a potential SQL exception. Once we've done all that, the main thing with databases is that you need to close the database. If the database is not closed, then you're going to have some problems later. So the final job there is to close the database. So whether it works or not, you're going to end up closing it. So again, the finally clause executed when even if the return statement is executed in the try or catch clause. Any uncaught or propagated exception still exits via that finally clause. So the final part of this video is the fact that you can define new exceptions. So if you find that the exceptions which are available from Java, of which there is a lot, is not enough of your requirements, you can actually build your own exceptions for your code. Now again, this is out of scope of this particular demonstration here, but if you do want to go ahead and create your own exceptions, then I've got a slide which will help you with that. Here's the slide here. So I've created a class here called noMatchingDetailsException, and that will extend exception. Within this, you then, in a normal way that you work with objects, you define fields and you have your methods. However, these methods are going to be very much based on exceptions. So you can define your own exceptions, and those exceptions will be created if the exception which you've created has been thrown. So that's pretty much it for this video and exceptions in general. The next lesson we're going to do is going to be connecting to a database. So I want you to investigate that class object and then that forName method to see what exception is thrown from it. I also want you to look into the statement class and the execute method, or execute query method, and see what exception is thrown from that method. So those are areas which we're going to look at, where we're going to need to try and catch those exceptions in the next video. See you then.